I was raised in an enchanted world. And I don't mean that hyperbolically, I mean that almost literally. My father is a brilliant storyteller. And through his stories, we would learn of matters of faith, matters of fantasy as well. He would entertain his children by telling us these grand tales of the fairies versus the Morlocks. And then my father became very busy around the age of 8, and we didn't hear many stories of that type. Instead, we heard stories of another type, and that of faith, of religion, of all of the histories, doctrines, lores, mythologies of the Mormon faith. See, many families are the varieties within that particular faith that when they're encouraged to have an activity called family home evening, that they'll do that every twice in a while. My family was very religious about that, quite literally religious about it. And then there would be church every Sunday. And then there would often be church on Wednesday when I was a kid as well. So we were engaged in church activities 3 days a week at a minimum. My father, when I was around age 8, started working on a doctorate degree in Middle Near Eastern history, basically the history of the New Testament of the Bible. It was his goal, you see, was to move from a seminary teacher for the Mormon faith, somebody who taught college students, to somebody who was a professor at a university. And the same stories we used to hear with the same verve and dynamism about fairies and their enemies and those preying upon them instead changed to stories within the religion. Stories of the New Testament, stories of the Book of Mormon. Our lives were very structured lives, and yet also with the tinge of fantasy. You see, because my parents were so devoutly religious, we didn't have really a television in the home growing up. When we had a TV that operated, it was very strict what we were allowed to watch, when and how, which was infrequent at best. So we lived our lives in books. We lived our lives in stories. I'm the middle of 7 children. And for years, we lived in a one-room schoolhouse in a little town called Linden, Utah. That the various owners of that one-room schoolhouse, the first schoolhouse in that particular part of the state, they'd added on a kitchen here and a bathroom there, all lean-tos. And that's where my love of books began. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis. Whereas many families would take trips out of town and out of country, for us, our trips were to the library. It was about a 2.5-mile walk, and we would walk to and from the library and come back with loads of books. And so not only did I have the fantasy and the tales of Tolkien, intermixed with that was the tales of Nephi from the Mormon faith, of Lehi, of Alma, of Laman, and of Lemuel, of all of these other stories. And so because we didn't have television, when I wasn't reading, I was daydreaming and writing. It is a beautiful thing being raised in an enchanted world, because it's a world where good always wins, bad always loses, where good things happen to good people, even after great trial and great travail, and bad things always happen to bad people, again, after great trial and great travail, often inflicted upon their own misdemeanorings, meanderings, and misdeeds. Life, though, has a way of disenchanting us. Through my teenage years, I was not willing to give up on my enchantment, nor was I even into adulthood. That notion that good can do good and make a difference in the world, that enchanted feeling, extended to how I care for, love, and relate to other people. When I was in 5th grade, for example, I was performing weddings amongst my 5th grade peers, as children will, not in the adult sense. That my teachers in 4th and 5th grade called me the gentle giant. One even called me Father Confessor because the other kids would come up and tell me of their woes, their trials, and I would hug them and comfort them and let them know that everything was going to be all right because I believed in my bones that it would be. Things change, sometimes slowly, sometimes abruptly. More of that in a moment. For now, I can remember I was 15 and I was on the phone with my friend Anne Marie. She had lined up her method of self-destruction. She was very suicidal. And so I spent the phone with her for a couple of hours, talking her down and trying to help her find a reason to live. And unbeknownst to me, my father was on the phone upstairs. For you youngins, there was one phone line going into the house. And so whichever phone you picked up in the home, it was all on the same line. So if I was on the phone in one part of the house and Dad was on the phone in the other part of the house, he could overhear my conversations. And my father very respectfully sat and listened, wondering if, I learned this later, wondering if he needed to call an ambulance or something for my dear friend. And then at the end, when she was safe and she had put everything away and went to talk to her mother, my father came downstairs. At this point, it was 2 a.m. in the morning. And of course, when Dad darkened my door, I knew I was in trouble. And much to my surprise, he was tearful. And he said, "There's a job for people like you." He said, "They're called psychologists." And he said, "Son, I think that may be your calling." It was nice to have that moment with my father. You see, my father was so strict when he was younger that my uncles jokingly referred to him as Rabbi Draper, because there was a rule for everything, and everything had a rule, and I was his rebellious son. And for those of you who know my father today, you encounter him as a very kind and sweet man, and he is. But back then, Dad and I could fight. And so for him to stop by and to prop me up like that and to thank me for loving Anne Marie the way I did and set me on a career path. So here I am with this grand imagination informed by Mormon stories as well as Tolkien and Lewis and all of these others. I set out on my grand quest to be a psychologist, whereas many of my friends changed their major again and again. I went straight through knowing this is how I was going to wage war against the forces of evil, where good does good and evil suffers and is destroyed, and I was going to be the noble paladin who would be a part of that. When I was 17, just an eye blink away from that conversation with Anne Marie, one day, we were building sets for a dance recital at the high school. And I was the big brawny one that would carry things up from downstairs and help maneuver things. And I did not yet have the aesthetic eye that I gained later. And so I was trusted to do the heavy lifting. And a bunch of us, after we had finished building the sets, we were going to go to Village Inn and get ourselves some huevos rancheros. And so we got in this little Datsun Corolla. For those of you who are my age or older, you remember that Corollas used to be made by Datsun. So imagine guys my size all packed into this little Datsun. And we went tearing down this long parking lot called the drag strip at our high school. And about halfway down, Jake, the driver, suddenly yells out, "There's Merm!" Grabs the emergency brake, much to the distress of the young man Ryan sitting on the emergency brake, because there were 6 of us in that tiny car, pulls the emergency brake and does a military turn, squealing those car tires around. And standing right outside on the sidewalk was a vision of 1980s loveliness. Goodness gracious, I'll never forget her. 6 foot tall, sun-bleached, light brown hair going down just beyond her shoulder. She had a barrette holding her hair back. She was in a tight pink sweater with 3 little wooden buttons. Acid-wash jeans, for those of you that remember what those were, in bright white LA Gear high tops, and glorious brown eyes. I had written some years later, to her, I said, Your eyes are the love I fell into, infinitely deep. And I will fall forever until those eyes close and my eternity ends. I'm so grateful for that meeting. Now, I would like to say that it was love at first sight. Well, it was for me, not for her. And so we've got these 6 men puppy-dogging around this 6 young men, we're all teenagers, puppy-dogging around this teenage girl, and she was not having it. And don't get me wrong, I put on my smooth, I put on the charm, I put on the humor, everything I could do to keep her attention, and I failed to. She rebuffed my advances very gently and with a determined stride made her way into the high school. Now, one of the things that's nice about having an ego that's a little bit above average in size is that you're used to putting yourself out there and used to getting rebuffed, and so I didn't think anything of it. I found out later she was actually battling the flu, and that's why she was so anxious to get away from us, and that she had a biology exam for a college extension course she was taking in the high school. But soon we met again, friends of a friend, and we've been together ever since. 33 years married, 35 years that we have known each other. And at times, I regret the hell that she's had to go through with me. And then I remember, if you're going to walk 666 miles of hell, it's better to do so with a companion, even if they don't deserve to be there. Some of those stories we may tell in different formats, in different ways, but for now. Through college, through graduate school, I was going to be a psychologist, still trying to figure out a way that I could practice this Mormon faith that I was raised in authentically. A couple months into graduate school, see, my sweetheart and I had a deal that we would both work full-time, go to school full-time, get our undergraduate degrees done. And then when I was off to graduate school, she would work full-time and put me through graduate school. That was the arrangement. And 3 months into graduate school, she informs me that it is time for her to have a baby. You see, in Mormon culture, we talk about gifts of the Spirit, and hers, in this particular cultural tradition, is the gift of prophecy. Anytime Miriam says, I have a feeling, please put on all brakes, stop what you're doing. This is my sweetheart's name, is Miriam. And listen, because something profound is going to come, and you may or may not like it, but it's going to be true and truthful. And she said she had a feeling it was time for her to start having children. And I kept thinking, well, how are you going to work full-time, go to school full-time, put me through school if you have children? And she looked at me, she said, I'm not going to be working. We spent 3 hours in the car talking about this, half arguing, half discussing. I was near panicking. How in the world am I going to do this? Working full-time, going to school full-time, especially in the doctoral program I was going to. We were forbidden from working. And she had a feeling. After one miscarriage, and we had called all the family when she first got pregnant, and that miscarriage was very devastating. But a little while later, she was pregnant with my oldest son. See, the children that I named, all of them have names that are uncommon. Jotham, my oldest, taken from the book of 2 Kings. There was one of these myths, these stories that I was raised on, is that there was a king called Uzziah. Now, whether or not this story is biblically accurate, I don't know. I will not make a claim to that. But this is the story I was told as a child, and it stuck with me. That King Uzziah had a son who was illegitimate and therefore could not ascend to the throne. And Uzziah used this son quite a bit to hire mercenaries and to lead Uzziah's various armies. And so Uzziah's son became very angry and wanted the throne to himself, and so overthrew the court. And so Jotham, being just a little boy in this particular story, goes in and sees his older half-brother slaughtering everyone, and he flees and runs out into the desert. And while he's out in the desert, the Spirit of the Lord appears to him and says, you are to return to that court and to tell everyone within the sound of your voice that they will burn as a reed in the desert. And so this terrified little boy, some tales say he was 8, some tales say he was 10. He comes back into the royal court and with his plaintive, thin, terrified boy voice goes, "You will burn like a reed in the desert," and then runs like mad out before these soldiers can kill him. And I remember hearing that story as a child and going, Jotham is an amazing name. Somebody who is that brave and yet has the common sense to run. That is a name I will remember. And so that's the name given to my eldest, Jotham. My middle child is named Diamlin. Diamlin, the diamond one, the diamond princess. Joseph Conrad wrote a novella called The Lagoon, and I did not like that story, but I really liked the name Diamlin, so I kept that one. And then Jareth, my youngest. We learned later that was the name of the Goblin King in a movie called The Labyrinth. I'll take it. And that's his gamer handle to this day, is Goblin King. We'll focus this story more on Jotham. Jotham came into the world contemplatively. That's the best way I can think. So Diamlin came into the world talking, and Jareth launched into the world, spoiling the poor OBGYN's shoes. He came into the world so enthusiastically. Amniotic fluids splashed everywhere. But Jotham came into the world thoughtfully. I'll never forget holding him when he opened his eyes for the first time. They were bright blue, little shock of brown hair on his tiny little head. And we made eye contact. I come from a culture where fatherhood is presumed, so much so there's a lot of it that they don't talk about. They don't talk about the profundity, just how profound it is to hold your child for the first time. There's a philosopher I quite like named Jean-Luc Marion. He talks about the event, he and his student Claude Romano. And these are the moments in your life where your world changes. It's not that you change, it's that the world changes. Your being in the world changes. It shifts. There's no going back at that point. And that's when my world shifted. I was now father. How does one do this? Years, tradition, centuries, and yet we can't write a book on it. We can't write a manual on it. There are various ideas that are helpful in various literature that's been published, various stories from father, from uncles, from grandfathers. And yet oftentimes you're left figuring it out for yourself, hopefully with the love and comfort of others. But holy cow, we were off on our own, states away from where we were raised. And now I'm a father. And Jotham was a remarkable baby, a remarkable person. He grew into boyhood immediately. I don't know how else to describe it. He skipped the baby phase. There's a picture, for example, we still have of Jotham as he should be a toddler, perched on my wife's hip, and she's looking at the camera with this very tall boy on her hip. But he was supposed to be a toddler, but he wasn't roly-poly or chubby. He skipped all of that and went straight to boy. Tall and thin, often the tallest in his class. I noticed, as a doctoral student studying development and human development, infant development, that I noticed Jotham was not developing in the stereotypified ways that are reported as normal in the textbooks. Instead, he was developing atypically, very precocious in some areas, and delayed, or some abilities were even absent. And so I fought against the diagnosis because he didn't clearly meet criteria for autism at the time. In fact, one of the things I've learned in studying autism is nobody really does. I fought that diagnosis for a while until Miriam, of course, my beloved, she goes and she finds all the resources that can be brought to bear for children with that particular label, and that's what convinced me to accept the label at least. But even then, Jotham's testing scores were greatly atypical. It's like his WIPSI score, the Weschler preschool, it's the little baby IQ test. His scores were all over the place. They were either very high or very low. He was either a genius or disabled. Likewise, with his Weschler intelligence score for children later in childhood, again, all over the place. And as a teenager, he was tested again. And again, the exact same pattern, either brilliant or disabled, all across the board with every subtest. And one of the things that I feel very grateful for is I have an uncle, for example, who is autistic, and I have cousins who are autistic. And so Jotham always felt normal to us. And I'm very grateful for that. And so therefore, it would be a challenge sometimes to remember to go to the school to advocate for him, to be able to say, okay, he has special needs, and here's the special needs he has, and here's how perhaps to meet those needs. I remember when Jotham was 5. At this point, we were living in Terre Haute, Indiana. We'd moved from Utah to Texas, back to Utah for a year for my clinical residency, and then we moved out to Indiana. Miriam had gotten a call from the school that Jotham had turned blue. And by the time Miriam got there, he was conscious again, breathing, and we took him to the doctors, and they informed us that he had a series of allergies and he would need special care and special treatment. And battling that boy's allergies became an ongoing battle of attrition well into his teen years. And Jotham grew quickly. See, I'm 6'6", and Jotham, by the time he stopped growing, was 6'7", 6'8". Whereas I'm stocky, Jotham was always very thin. So we'll skip a lot of Jotham's story in the name of time and talk about how his senior year of high school, he went from skinny to emaciated, from thin to skeletally thin. And we were pretty worried. And so we're taking him to doctors, and the allergists, his allergies are a problem. He was constantly struggling to breathe. His lungs were inflamed, we were told. But then after he graduated from high school, it became acutely difficult for him to breathe. He was coughing constantly. And so I remember one day I took him to the doctor, and we were told he had pneumonia. And they showed us the image. Half of his chest was just whited out with what we were told was infection. And the doctors told us that if he starts striding, meaning struggling to breathe in and out, that we were to take him to the emergency room immediately, and they prescribed him very potent antibiotics. So one day, he was coughing and struggling to breathe, but not abnormally so when we left. People wonder why Miriam and I are so close to this day, and it's because we go on a date once a week. It's one of the many reasons. And so we were on our Friday night date, and we were about 15 minutes away from the house when Miriam said, I have a feeling we need to turn around and head back. And she used those terms again, I have a feeling. So we flipped around, we went back, and Jotham was semi-conscious, sitting at his little computer desk, and he was striding. He was desperately trying to survive. So we grabbed him. We looked at how long it would take an ambulance to get there. We realized we could take him to the hospital quicker. So I carried my 6'7" son out to the car, and we drove to the nearest emergency room. And when they saw him and he was pale, his eyes were sunken in, his lips were blue, they immediately took him back, even though there was a dozen people waiting in the waiting room. And they took Jotham back immediately, got him on oxygen, and we're sitting there waiting in the admitting room. And an eternity of 30 minutes went by. And the physician's assistant there in the emergency room came in, put up the x-rays of Jotham's chest. And he asked us about them. And I said, yeah, that's the pneumonia. And he said, I'm sorry, that's not pneumonia. And he showed us on the image, as crude as it was, the way it was vascular, meaning that there was whatever it was in his chest was pulling blood from the rest of his body. It was pushing on his mediastinal tissue, so that all that connective tissue that holds your lung and trachea and esophagus and heart where it is, whatever it was pushing against those, making it hard for him to breathe, making it hard for his heart to operate. They showed us where his heart had grown elongated through the years. It wasn't shaped like this. It was shaped more like a banana. And he said, I'm sorry, this is not an infection. This is a tumor. He says it's too easy for us, it's too early for us to know what it is right now. And he said, and I've never seen anything like it. The next little bit is a blur, where we learned that Jotham had an 8-pound teratoma in his chest. Years of taking him to doctors. One doctor assuming with another doctor, the way physicians' assumptions understandably domino one into another, where when they receive, it's obviously allergies. He's allergic to a whole bunch of things. That's been verified and re-verified. But no one thought to do a detailed chest x-ray because they thought there was no need. They knew what the problem was. So this type of tumor is called a teratoma. If you look up teratomas on Wikipedia, you'll see that they're the kinds of cancers which might be growing hair or teeth. But Jotham's tumor was dedifferentiated, meaning that in a biopsy, every little cell within his teratoma was a different type of cell, a skin cell, a nerve cell, a bone cell. The tumor itself was cartilaginous, meaning it was heavy and bouncy like an 8-pound ball of cartilage. All I knew was that my son was in crisis. And I was scared, terrified at the same time, though I knew the magic. I lived in an enchanted world, and I knew the magic that would take care of this. I knew the spells. And the spells were fasting and praying, of having great faith, because this is how good triumphs over evil, is by pulling down, allying with the forces of the divine, such that great evil, like the cancer in a teenage boy, might be conquered. And with great vigor and gusto, I began the magic. I began to fast. I began to pray. Everyone who knew and loved Jotham, which of course was quite a number of people, Jotham was very lovable in that way, began to fast and pray on his behalf. In the Mormon community, a congregation is called a ward, so the ward had special fasts for Jotham. And Miriam and I, for the next month, lived in the hospital. And I wondered if my boy would be all right, but I knew that if I could just hold the ritual, if I could just hold the spell, everything would be fine. That faith began to crack one night. They didn't know how to remove such a large tumor out of such a small frame. Yes, he was tall, but he was also very thin. His bones were narrow. And so while they were debating that for literally weeks, how to access that tumor, one day Jotham was struggling to breathe, laying in his hospital bed, and he went into crisis. His O2 levels were dropping fast. And I heard the beeping, and Miriam came in, and she was white as a sheet, trying to comfort him, and he was starting to panic, which was making it worse. And as I came in the room, he sat straight up. Those brilliant blue eyes looked right at me, and gasping, he said, "Father, this is the end of me. This is the end of me." And I calmed him down. Years of crisis intervention experience, teaching breathwork, teaching meditation classes. But how do you do that? How do you teach somebody to breathe when they can't? When their trachea is being crushed by a tumor that is growing every day? You find other ways to ground them, other ways to get them back into a feeling other than that of suffocation. And so calm, he eventually passed out, and his O2 levels slowly went up again. But that one, it dawned on me then, maybe the ritual isn't working. Maybe the faith that fuels the magic is insufficient for an evil of this magnitude, but I shook it off. Eventually, they decided that what they were going to do is take Jotham, bend him over a table face up, and they were going to perform what's called a clamshell surgery. This is where they cut somebody from underneath the ribs up along the sternum from side to side and open them up like a clamshell. The surgeon, a fellow by the name of John, wonderful man. The surgery took 2 hours longer than they thought. It was a 10-hour surgery, and I paced a hole in the floor around that emergency room, I swear, around the operating room, in the waiting area, until we learned that the tumor was out. They were really worried about reinflating his lungs because they were worried that the teratoma had destroyed his lung tissue. Miraculously enough, it had not, and that little crack in my faith was healed. That they reinflated his lung, a lung that had been displaced and crushed against his rib cage, and he could breathe. We spent the next week or two, I can't remember, in the intensive care unit. I'll never forget when Dr. John came and he was checking up on Jotham after the surgery. And he was standing at the nurse's station, and he came up and he was in dry tones trying to walk me through what they had done and what the findings were. He started to choke up about halfway through. And he started to tear up, and he shook himself, and he goes, "I don't know why, but cases like this make me goofy. I feel so goofy." And I patted him on the back, gave him a side hug, and I said, "This isn't goofy. This is feelings, right? This is relief and gratitude. This is a lot of things. Goofy is a word, but this is an important feeling, Doc." And I got to watch the culmination of the magic. My son began to heal. His color came back. He started putting on weight. He got himself a little job at a shop called Desert Industries. Desert Industries is like the Goodwill that the Mormon church owns, and people with various disabilities or various challenges can work there. It's a way for them to make some money when they would be otherwise unemployable. And a couple months went by. I was sitting with Jotham in Sunday school, and I was rubbing his back. And he found that very soothing, and being around a lot of people was stressful for him, but by golly, he was a kid of faith, and he believed to his bones in this religion. And I found a lump on his back, and I felt a surge of panic. So it took some convincing and some fighting, but got him into the doctor, and the doctor looked at the lump and said, "Oh, that's nothing to worry about. It's just a lipoma, just a lump of heavy fatty tissue." And I went, "This kid's really skinny." And they assured me that lipomas can happen even with slender people. And so I left, and then the next day I was talking to Jotham, and he talked about how his lower back hurt. And so I felt, and there was another lump. And then what I thought was a pimple here underneath his lip, another lump. And again, I'm panicking, and I'm taking him to the doctors, and they're assuring me that nothing is wrong. They kept looking for human growth hormone, right? Basically what they do is they do pregnancy tests, and if a man comes up positive with pregnancy tests, then he has a tumor of some variety that's giving off that particular hormone. So testicular cancer, for example, will do that. And because part of the cancer in his chest, part of the very many different types of tissues that it was made of, was giving off human growth hormone, they kept checking for that. And because it was negative, they kept telling me he was cancer-free without doing any other tests. Well, eventually, underneath one of his ribs, he came to me one day and it was poking out. And this was now lump number 6. And it grew very quickly. And I had to fight. People reassuring me everything's fine, and I'm panicking. I'm the hysterical father, according to one physician. And we pushed and fought and pushed and fought. One day, my dear friends John and Joe were in town, and we were going to get that biopsied. I'd had to keep putting my foot down. I had to keep insisting on this. And so we took Jotham to the hospital to have it biopsied. And they couldn't get him numb for some reason, and so out of desperation, they cut the tumor out anyway, and it was the size of a lemon. And just his gritting his teeth and moaning as they were cutting it out of him, his thin little hands crushing mine. And they biopsied it. It took, of course, an eternity of weeks for us to get the results back. We were supporting my sister, who at the time owned a little food truck where she would custom make you candy bars while you waited. It was a brilliant idea. We were supporting her in a little city called Orem, Utah. And that's when the email dinged that the results were in. And we looked, and it was the cancer. And it was back. And a large crack formed in my faith in the magic. So Miriam and I were walking around the little park there in front of the Sierra Theater, which is where the food truck roundup was, just crying and wondering what we were going to do. So specialists and doctors, this particular teratoma, once they did a more thorough biopsy, is extremely rare. The world's leading expert, or the United States' leading expert on this particular cancer, happened to be at a hospital some 60 miles north of where we were living. And that physician agreed to take on a consulting role with our oncologist in American Fork, another little town in Utah. And at first it seemed to work. This particular research physician up 60 miles north in Midvale got us on a panel, got Jotham on a panel of an experimental medication, and the tumors began to shrink. And we had that problem of breakdowns of communication because the research oncologist up in South Salt Lake in Midvale assumed he was only doing half the job, and our oncologist in American Fork was doing the other half, but there was poor communication between the two of them. And all I know is trips and radiation and this pill form of chemotherapy. It was all a blur. Until one day, I learned they were going to discontinue the medication. That the Jotham had had yet another scan, and the number of tumors, they had lost count. He had tumors from his ankles all the way up to the top of his head. And yes, the medication was shrinking them, but it was also destroying his liver. And so they discontinued the chemo. Fighting and arguing and trying to find out, all while trying to remain civil, if not diplomatic. The recommendation came down from these doctors that Jotham was to be put on hospice. And then for 2 months, my wife and I were on hospice watch with our son. It is a gray blur. This is the part of the 666 miles of hell I referred to, that nobody should go through this. People have told me afterwards, and even during, I can't even imagine, and I ask them not to. It is not something I want you to imagine. There are experiences that we have that we are not evolved to handle. That's one of the things about trauma is our ancestors did not have to deal with some of the things we have to deal with today. We are misevolved for certain things. The death of a child is one of those things we're just misevolved to handle. We cannot handle that. We are not designed to. And so instead you pull in all of the coping that you can. One of the things I'm eternally grateful for is the Mormon faith is very good at community. We didn't cook a meal for 2 months. It took us another year to finish all the freezer meals that we had been given. And Miriam and I, on 24-hour watch, grew exhausted. We started to decompensate. One of our daughters, Diamelin, was out of the house a lot. She did not want to be home facing all of this grief and all of this stress, until one day she came to us and she said, all this whole time I've not known what to do because I don't know what to do for Jotham. And I can't take care of Jotham. but I can take care of you. She was 15 at the time. Kayla, her sister, likewise. Kayla had come to live with us by her choice and is one of our dear daughters. And it was her suggestion that I reach out to you all. Thank you, Kayla. And so Kayla likewise compensated. And Jareth, even though he was 12 at the time, he's doing his level best. And people are bringing in resources, but Miriam and I are burning the candle at both ends and in the middle. And we were starting to fall apart physically and emotionally. We were starting to get sick. And so in desperation, I started posting on various social media, hey, could we get help tending our son so we can take a nap, etc. And her brothers were kind enough to come. They have a very colorful history as well. And they showed up. Friends I had not seen in decades showed up. People who were not affiliated with the Mormon faith. They didn't come up with meals. They came with time where they would sit with Jotham. Mike and Tina and Bruce and others were very kind to sit and tend him so Miriam and I could go get a nap, clinging to one another and crying ourselves to sleep in one another's arms. The magic wasn't working. All the fasting, all the praying, it wasn't working. Through this process, I lost about 40 pounds. Skipping so many meals, just holding. See, fasting is what it's called. Fasting comes from the Old English word feast, and it means to seize upon with such passion and vigor that you forget other things. Like if you're fasting with the scriptures, it just means you're seizing upon these holy words to the point where nothing else matters and everything else falls away. That when you fast, it is because you are so seized upon an idea that you forget to eat. It's not that you choose to skip eating, it's that you don't think to, because you're holding to other things. And hold I did, even as I'm watching my son deteriorate before my eyes. Losing weight, the pink of his cheeks again fading to a gray pallor, his eyes remaining bright, because Jotham believed in the magic. Jotham believed in the ritual and in the spell. That when the cancer had spread and the tumors were growing, before the cancer robbed him of the ability to speak, his last spoken words were a prayer. And he prayed to Heavenly Father, this God that Mormons pray to, that when I am healed, not if, when, he never doubted the potency of the magic. Jotham was struggling to live. It was 2 days after the cancer robbed him of the ability to speak. And I could tell he was holding on for us. So we gathered around his hospital bed there in his bedroom. And we held him and we prayed for him as a family. That he had suffered enough and he could go. He died 15 minutes later. Watching his paper-thin skin, the blood going from bluish to blackish, every vein in his body pronounced until it all faded to gray. And I stood there, holding his body. The magic failed. Evil triumphed, not in the face of one good person. Evil triumphed in the face of dozens, if not hundreds. That next Sunday, We were in church. Bereft. I don't know of a better word. You know, many of you are familiar with the Wong-Baker Faces scale. When you go to the doctors and they say, how much pain are you in? And they'll show you this little diagram with faces on it, from smiley face to very distressed face. It's the Faces scale. And 10 is as high as it goes. There is an 11. Just like with third-degree burns, the fire burns so deep that it destroys nerve tissue. And it doesn't hurt because all the nerve tissue has been burned away. That's what life gives us sometimes, is it burns away our ability to feel, and that 11 is numb. That is where you're bereft of feeling, you're bereft of thought. If a psychic could read my mind during that time, it would be white noise. There is an 11. One of our friends in this congregation, in the ward, came up and said, and assured us that their uncle, who had stage 3 lymphoma, they had fasted and prayed for them. And, you know, a couple weeks later, the uncle went in for another test and the cancer had miraculously vanished. And they assured me that if I had just had better faith, more faith, deeper faith, Jotham would have lived. And that's when I lost my faith. You see, Jotham never doubted. Yes, I struggled, but I held to the magic. I held to the ritual. You see, I was drowning in grief. Those walls of water, you know, in therapy we talk about the waves of grief. Those walls of water, as they come over you and you're gasping, trying desperately to survive, trying to keep your head above water, and you can't. And after a while you lose strength as you're just trying to breathe, and you sink deeper and deeper in the depths. And in those cold, crushing, lightless places, that's when we learn how to breathe water. There is an 11. I have been a big fan of my field. And so responsibly, I said, okay, we need to get ourselves into therapy, individually and collectively. And I tried therapist after therapist. After the initial consultation, I got fired is the colloquial word for it, where they're like, we can't help you. I'm sorry, I can't help you. I'm sorry, I can't help you. How do you tell somebody who has written and published and spoken, who has trained, I don't know how many hundreds of therapists I've trained at this point, and when I am bereft, who can help me? You know, there's that old adage, physician, heal thyself, from Shakespeare. Who heals the healer? And that's when I became aware of the lie of my own profession. You see, in psychology, we have this habit of locating your suffering inside of you. We're not very good at looking at the world the way it actually is, that we are beings in relation. You and I are in relation to one another through this digital media. We are beings in the world with one another and alongside things that matter. We are a part of one another. The Buddhists were right. You know what I mean? That this interbeing, this co-being of being, that when there are ruptures of this co-being, of course we feel it, and of course it matters. We're not just localized within ourselves. We are in a nexus of relationships, and when that relationship breaks, we break with it. And that is important. Who then can I find to talk to me about it in a field that assumes that my suffering is within me, that I am broken? It's not the nexus of relating that's broken. It's something internal to me that's broken. And thankfully, my fourth try, I found Susan. She was fixing to retire. She was in her early 80s. She had actually been a therapist in an oncology ward. And she knew the language. And she knew that I am not mentally ill in a way that needs to be cured. But instead, I need help as I learn to breathe this cold and crushing water. We worked together for 6 months, and it changed the way I think about this. For me, therapy is no longer curing a diagnosable mental illness. Instead, it has become how to love others, relate to others, help them cope in the face of what a broken world gives them. A colleague of mine was lamenting the other day, says the mental health rates amongst kids these days is abysmal. And I looked at him and said, my children will never be able to afford a home. They're talented, they work hard, they have good jobs, and they'll never be able to afford a home. And you're thinking it's something internal to my kids? This is why they're stressed and anxious and depressed? No, it's the world that we have given them is fractured. And so how do we care for people in a fractured world? Because the world has a way of fracturing us. You see, this brokenness of our world, the pain of it, the weight of it sinks into our bones like lead. It weighs us down, it slows us down, it can make every step painful. Every interaction is effortful. But if we pay attention, it is the very lead in our bones that weighs us down, that prompts us to lift others up. That when you've descended below all things, you don't want anyone to descend at all. You would like for people to feel loved and supported, and so that's what you do. As heavy as the lead is in your bones, it is the source of your power and of your compassion. Thank you, Susan. I told my wife, sweetie, I will go to church, and on the third time where I hear that if we had enough faith, the magic would have worked, that Jotham would have lived and have been healthy. I said, I will tolerate hearing that message 3 times. It took a week and a half. Does that mean I hate the religion of my family? No, quite the contrary. Mormons do community extremely well, and I have faith in community. I no longer have faith in the magic. What then do I have faith in? Well, love. The night before Jotham died, I had a dream. We could massage and maneuver his bones such that the tumors wouldn't press on the nerves enough and he could get micronaps. He could sleep for short periods of time. It took a lot of effort on our parts, and it was worth it if it meant he could sleep and get some reprieve. So I had just given him a massage and moved his pelvis around so he could sleep, and I sat down in the chair next to his bed and I fell asleep. And in this dream, I was scrambling up shale. In our area of Utah, we have many tall mountains, and we get what are called shale slides. This is where very sharp plates of rock come off the mountains and fill in these canyons. And for whatever reason, I was desperate and determined to climb up this shale slide. And I was climbing, and my feet were getting shredded, and I would fall, and it would cut my knees and my elbows, and I would slide down on my back. It would lacerate my back, and I was determined. I was fierce. I set my jaw, and I tried to climb again and again, and I fell again and again, broken and bleeding. And as I laid there demoralized, between me and the all too bright burning sun, a silhouette leaned over me, and in a voice like distant thunder said, "This hurts. Oh, how I know how this hurts. When you're ready, let me help you up, and we will walk together." Jaw set against my own pride, I let this person help me up. And to my surprise, we didn't walk up the mountain. We walked along the face of it. No marked trails, beaten paths. Instead, we were maneuvering through the scrub, through the trees, and we encountered many others who were struggling and climbing or resting. Some were talking and socializing. Faces beyond count, beyond number, we encountered as we walked along the mountain, and all of them were on this eternal mountain. See, the mountain was as tall as life is long, that there's no really getting to the top of it. And so I wondered then, what would make this climb worth it? My mind's eye disengaged from where we were at in the mountain and zoomed at the top. And sure enough, at the very pinnacle, at the very peak, I saw people reaching that coveted destination, to collapse in wearied exhaustion and look around themselves, embracing others, that they had finally made it to the top. Some, pulled by compassion, would descend the mountain again. And for me, looking at the very top of that mountain where the throne of God should be, because surely that's the point. Surely this magic works and it brings us all back to the divine. The throne of God sat empty. And I felt rage. Where is this God that so many of his children suffer as we try to climb up to him? And then I realized the profound truth. The truth of this eternal mount, as tall as life is long. God is wherever one person says to another. Where one person says to another, this hurts. Oh, how I know how much this hurts. When you're ready, let me help you up. And we will climb together. Divinity is found in the face of the other. Kindness in the face of cruelty, patience in the face of impatience, love in the face of indifference. And that's the secret. I may have lost my faith in magic. I may have lost my faith in the way my profession does things. But I have not lost faith in hope. I have not lost faith in love. So to all of you out there for whom the magic did not work, for those of you who lost loved ones, I get it. And there are so many of us out there. You know, Hemingway wrote in Farewell to Arms, for whom the world does not kill, it breaks. And it breaks the very lovely, the very kind, and the very capable alike. One thing you will find when you hold to the faith in kindness and love is that your heart will be cracked so wide that others can walk in and find shelter there. May we all have broken hearts, that we may provide shelter for one another. Thank you for hearing part of my story.
Thank you, May.